It's 1:38 a.m. Time for Octoberpod. Good morning. I'm your host, Edward October. The late great radio dramatist William M. Robeson once defined radio drama as a microphone, a voice, and a story. In that vein, we present this morning's Octoberpod with no more than the usual audio-visual trimmings. In short, we've stripped the Octoberpod down to its most basic components. We hope, however, that our experiment in minimalism does not detract from your enjoyment of The Littlest Angel. That's the name of our story. The Littlest Angel. Submitted by UT Catmom. When we were little, Granddad used to tell us ghost stories whenever we went camping. He'd stoke up the campfire and spin yarns about ghost trains and lost Indian tribes, of phantom lovers searching the woods for one another, and of the Bigfoot-like creature who eats all the catfish from the lake. But the story that sticks with me most is the curse of Settlers Point. In the 1780s, several families of Scotch-Irish immigrants, fur trappers mostly, set down roots in the foothills outside the trading post that would one day become my hometown. They had everything they needed to survive and prosper. Decades passed. Then around the turn of the century, Gray's Chapel, Settlers Point's first permanent church, was built. A small collection of trappers and farmers had finally become a community. Settlers Point was too small to have its own preacher, so for years they'd share preachers with small churches and nearby communities. Settlers Point had a tendency to draw fire and brimstone preachers, Old Testament wrath and New Testament revelation. Then in 1938, during the Great Depression, Reverend Jubal Trent was asked to become the first permanent minister of Grace Chapel. It was said that Reverend Trent's sermons were fiery and full of bloody gore. By all accounts, though, his congregation loved it. But all that changed after a series of dalliances between Reverend Trent and the daughter of a respected tobacco farmer. The good Reverend put a baby in her belly. When the poor girl's father found out, he had Reverend Trent beaten half to death and run out of town. According to Granddad's story, Reverend Trent put a curse on the town as he left. "By God, this town will drown in blood," so he said. When the solstice came that year, it brought with it the fulfillment of the Reverend's awful curse. The low temperatures that winter shattered records, and it seemed the thaw would never come. Farmers had to sow crops late in the growing season. What crops were planted fell victim to a mysterious blight. Many families scraped and starved that year. Banks foreclosed on farms and people left, penniless after generations of prosperity. What's more, a strain of flu burned its way through Settlers Point, killing off half the very young or the very old. The old folks, like Granddad, claimed that the townspeople went to church every Sunday and prayed for relief from their misfortune. Whenever he told the story, Granddad would say that even if God sent the littlest angel to help them, it'd be a blessing. No such blessing came. A year later to the day, a lumber mill worker who lived in a holler several miles below Settlers Point saw two girls no older than 11 or 12 stumbling down from the mountain wearing rags and bloodied from head to foot. They were hysterical and babbled about demons. demons who swarmed the city and slaughtered everyone in sight. They left none alive. It was a miracle these girls managed to escape the demons' scrutiny. The man who found them obviously didn't believe their story, but he called the sheriff anyway. The sheriff and a handful of deputies made their way up the lonely mountain road. When they got to Settlers Point, they found a massacre, the likes of which they'd only read about in westerns. Women and children lay slaughtered in the unpaved streets. The ground was black and sticky with blood and gore. A handful of men had been butchered and lashed to trees and signposts. The FBI became involved in the investigation, but quickly lost interest when no link to any famous gangsters could be established. Still, they managed to determine that all, or nearly all, of those poor people were killed with some sort of unidentifiable high-caliber firearm. A firearm so powerful it could obliterate human tissue into dust. No one ever came to live there again. Properties were foreclosed on, and the whole town was left in the woods to deteriorate. In the decades since the massacre, the woods have grown up around it so much that you can't even tell there was even a town up there. But according to Granddad, if you know where to look, it's easy enough to find the cursed ruins of Settlers Point. Pretty neat story, huh? Especially for around the campfire. I've spent many a restless night under the stars, haunted by Granddad's tale. And like all good campfire stories, it has its basis in fact. There is a real Settlers Point, a small town deserted after a real massacre. I don't know about the curse or about the demons, but everything else happened just as Granddad said. Me and my friends in high school used to load up in the car and drive around looking for the abandoned mountain road that led to the ghost town. We never found it, though we spent many autumn nights trying. When I was doing my master's coursework, I'm a social worker now, I wrote a paper on the sociological effects of violence on small communities. I chose Settlers Point as my subject. Now, I won't bore you with all the historical bits I dug up. However, I did find the exact location of the Settlers Point ruins. During spring break of that year, I traveled back home with my boyfriend, and we set aside a day to go backpacking up there. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you something important. The campfire tale that Granddad told said that the preacher was run out of town, and he cursed the town as he left, but according to my research, he was beaten to death by an angry mob, right there on the steps to the church. This was according to a concerned citizen who wrote a letter to the editor of the county newspaper. A friend of mine in law school combed through some vintage police records, but couldn't find any charges filed in relation to this murder. Okay, so where was I? Oh yeah, the ruins. So we backpacked, me and my boyfriend, we backpacked up to Settlers Point. It was much farther from my hometown than I expected. In fact, it was about sundown when we got all the way up there. The town was much smaller than I thought. Maybe a bunch of buildings had been razed, but what we saw looked like nothing more than a general store and a church. I say church, but it was really just a one-room chapel. This was the only building we stepped inside because the general store / post office and the one home still standing were in such bad shape that we thought just stepping inside would cause the thing to crumble. The church was a solid structure built from stone. When we found it, there was a young poplar growing straight up through a hole in the roof. A carpet of weeds and sticker bushes sat it apart from the town square. Its stone walls looked all hairy with moss and ivy. The church was eerie. The whole time I was inside it, I couldn't stop thinking that a man was lynched on the steps of this very building. After that, we explored the area in widening circles. We found a handful of deserted homes, monuments to abandoned lives. And there was an eerie sense of sadness that hung about the whole place. But we set up our tents not far from the remnants of Settlers Point. It was a wild, restless night for sure. I kept dreaming that the ghost of Reverend Trent was lingering just outside our tent. If the wind blew, or a leaf or twig dropped on our tent, I'd imagine it was his blood dripping onto the rain fly. Well, now we can fast forward to about a week and a half later. I managed to track down the name of a woman who lived in Settlers Point during the Depression. She is way up in her 90s and was in hospice care in Knoxville. Her name was Eunice Bumgardner, and she would have just been a little girl at the time of the massacre. I know what you're thinking. Not many people would have gone to such lengths for a master's project, and I'm no private detective. Let's just say I knew some people who could pull some strings. Anyway, I spoke to Eunice's daughter and arranged to visit the old lady at her bedside. We spoke for a long time between her naps. She is fairly well sedated. A lot of our little talk was about UT football and gardening, so I won't bore you with a blow-by-blow recount of our conversation. With a little prodding from her daughter, who was an old lady herself, Eunice told me a little bit about her time at Settlers Point. What she could remember, that is. Apparently, more people survived it than the legend would imply. She wasn't one of the blood-spattered little girls who came off the mountain, but Eunice said she knew them both from church. I asked her about Reverend Trent. She said she didn't remember him and was, of course, not there when he was beaten to death. But she said she remembered seeing red stains on the church step and asking her daddy about it. He told her that some hobo had come into town and cleaned and gutted some trout right there on the steps before someone ran him off. She didn't believe this story when she was a kid. She became less lucid as her meds started to kick in, but she repeatedly said that things were bad in Settlers Point. People barely scraping by. We prayed and prayed for a little angel to come and put an end to all this struggle and misery, she said. She also said that people were praying to be cleansed of the sins that Reverend Trent had infected the town with. Her doctor was planning on visiting soon, so I kinda hastily asked about the massacre. She was visibly pissed off at my questions, but she answered them as best she could. She said she was walking home from the dime store when the strangers came into town. That's what she called them, strangers. They were all beautiful, like movie stars, except they were dressed awfully peculiar. Eunice said she walked past one of them and remembered, thinking his eyes were black. How many of them were there? Were they all men? I asked. They were just so beautiful, she said, looking at a point somewhere on the ceiling. Then she looked back at me with a severe expression on her face. We lived a good piece outside town. I was halfway home before I heard the booming. Gunshots, I asked? Booming. And screams. Screams like the lake of fire, she said. She was beginning to doze off. I had to ask her one last question. Eunice, do you believe that those strangers were demons? Demons? They weren't demons. Child, we prayed them there.
true crime listeners, check out our podcast, I Said Goddamn. We're a true crime comedy podcast hosted by two besties who like to share messed up cases that make you say goddamn. Every Sunday, we try to one-up each other's story by sharing a horrific case the other has never heard of. Along the way, we splash in some wildly inappropriate jokes and colorful language. Listen every Sunday from any of your favorite podcast directories. Also, follow us on Twitter at ISGD Podcast or visit our website, isgdpodcast.com.